Transhumanism is a movement based on the idea that we can and we should use technology to sort of push out the boundaries of the human condition, to make ourselves immortal and to fuse ultimately with machines.
And how does this work? How do you fuse a person with a machine?
Well, there are various kinds of ideas that transhumanists are invested in. One of them is mind uploading, the idea that we can sort of scan our brains and convert the information in our neurons into computable code, and in theory upload that code into any kind of substrate that you might want to use, be it a cloud platform, a computer, a robot, a toaster oven. Any kind of machinery is at least theoretically something that we can replace our human bodies with. So it's all about transcending the kind of animal condition that we find ourselves in.
So in the same way you download an app to your iPhone, this is downloading yourself to a computer.
Right. The analogy they use, it's referred to variously as brain uploading and whole brain emulation. So the analogy that is often used is that of emulating a piece of software that's designed for one platform, for one kind of computer on another. So like, emulating your Mac software on a PC or vice versa. So that's the analogy.
Is that still you if it's an emulation of your brain?
Right. There's various ways of thinking about this. My sort of initial instinct would be that it can't be still you. My sort of instinctual sense of it is that we are our bodies, that you can't extract the mind from the substrate of the brain and it's still you. But there are kind of there's what's known as the ship of Theseus idea from sort of ancient Greek philosophy, and it's this idea that you have a ship and you replace one plank on the ship, one board, it's still your ship. But if you replace all the planks on the ship over time, is it still the same ship? So there's a kind of a continuum that happens with the idea of brain uploading. So if you replace like part of your brain, your cerebral cortex or whatever, with an implant, okay, maybe that is still you. You're upgraded, you're operating at a different level, but you're still essentially you. If you replace all of the brain with technology, is that still you? It's an open question. It's an interesting question. Part of what the book does is explore those questions.
So why did you decide to write a book about transhumanism?
I find the sort of Promethean aspect of this stuff really interesting. I'm really drawn to people who have what seem to be crazy ideas and who pursue them with kind of ruthless logic and dedication. I find that really fascinating. I'm also, from my own point of view, I guess it ties in with certain sort of anxieties and fears and discomforts that I myself have about, my own mortality, my own sort of imperfection as a human being. So in a way, I kind of identify with a lot of where transhumanism comes from. Transhumanism, I think, comes from this kind of innately human dissatisfaction with being human that most of us share, I think. What's fascinating to me about it is that they sort of want to roll up their sleeves and apply technology to this problem in a way that is really fascinating and troubling, but a way that's also kind of, I think, quite an extreme sort of intensification of tendencies that are already there in our culture. The idea that technology can solve all our problems, and the idea that progress is kind of an inevitable sort of impetus on human experience.
You talk about some of these people with their vision and their passion and their determination. They're quite a strange gallery of characters in the book. Talk to me about the type of people you encountered.
Yeah, I mean, as you would imagine, people with these kinds of obsessions can be quite eccentric. But I guess one of the things that I sort of experienced when writing the book is that, I went into it being fascinated first and foremost by the ideas, by the extremity of the ideas, by how radical they were, by how potentially terrifying they were. And the ideas seemed completely alien to me. So I wanted to encounter the people who are driven by these ideas. And what I found again and again is that although, they're eccentric and they have very extreme notions and, quite different ideas about what it means to be human, I kind of found almost across the board that I could identify with these people, that they were coming from a very human place, that they were coming from, a lot of them had childhood obsessions with with science fiction and with sort of traveling the universe and with not being confined to the limitations of their human bodies. And these kinds of concerns I saw kind of over and over again. And although I still find the ideas very distressing and very disturbing, it was interesting to see the human places that they came from and to see the kind of irreducible humanity of the people who hold these ideas. So in a way, that's kind of what the book is about.
Talk to me about Alcor.
So Alcor is the world's largest cryopreservation facility, the largest of 4 cryopreservation facilities in the world. And it's this place in essentially an industrial estate outside of Phoenix, Arizona, where a whole bunch of bodies are essentially frozen in liquid nitrogen. People sign up for this service. In general, they would sign over their life insurance policies to the company. And they're kept in these giant sort of stainless steel dewars in this huge warehouse. So yeah, I spent an afternoon in Alcor speaking with the people who worked there, speaking with Max Moore, who's the CEO there, and also a kind of a fairly influential philosopher of transhumanism. And I got to see the place where they process the bodies and the places where the bodies are kept. So that was interesting and disturbing in a very kind of sci-fi sort of way. So what generally happens is that the bodies are taken in and decapitated because most people only want their heads preserved. The idea being, I suppose, that by the time you die, your body is going to be too decrepit to be much use to you when you come back to life anyway. So the notion that transhumanists tend to invest themselves in is the notion of mind uploading. So you just keep the brain. You take the brain out of storage at the end of whatever period elapses between now, you're dying, and technology advancing to such a point where we can bring people back to life. And the brain is scanned, the information in your brain, yourself, is uploaded to a machine, and you spend the rest of eternity as a robot.
The book is interesting about mortality and parenthood, and these seem to be 2 highly personal events in your life that have propelled you into this world. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I started writing the book. I started thinking very seriously about the topic around about the time my son was born. My son is almost 4 now. But when he was born, I guess I started to just become slightly, maybe unhealthily preoccupied with the fragility of the human body and his fragility as a tiny baby. And I guess my own mortality, something about becoming a father, made me realize I was going to die. And so those kinds of fears and discomforts, I guess, in a way that happens, I suppose, if you're a creative person in any kind of way, got sublimated into this obsession with transhumanism. And I started to write about these anxieties through the kind of lens of this sort of quite weird idea. And, you know, as well as everything else that's interesting about transhumanism, it was a way of allowing me to deal with all these kinds of like diffuse topics like death and sort of human fragility and sort of the various kind of dissatisfactions with the human condition. I mean, it's very difficult to overlook the extent to which transhumanism has certain sort of crossovers with religion. I would be reluctant to refer to it as a religion because there's no God. If there is a God in transhumanism, it's yourself. You yourself become the God. So in a way, it's maybe a religion of extreme individualism or a religion of technology. But what's interesting about transhumanism is that it comes from, I think, the same place as most religions. It comes from, again, the sort of dissatisfaction with the limitations of being human, the fact that we die, which is, impossible to really assimilate, impossible to really come to terms with. So it comes from the same place. It also comes from the same place, I think, as a lot of art. This kind of confusion about our place in the world. Are we animals? Are we something else? So that's one of the things that's most interesting about it. The difference, of course, is that transhumanism, at least in theory, can achieve these ends, whereas the promise of religion is quite sort of abstract. Whereas transhumanists will at least tell you that we can get there through technology. We can become as gods.
Are all transhumanists very unusual people? Because the sense from the book is that they are.
Are they unusual people? Yeah, they are, definitely. I mean, their ideas are inherently very strange, and their pursuit of those ideas is, makes them unusual people. They weren't always as eccentric or as sort of obviously unusual as you might expect them to be. One of the kind of interesting things about the book, about writing the book for me, was encountering people who had these really, really strange ideas and were pursuing them in this very sort of single-minded, monomaniacal way, and yet were able to be quite convincing, to me at least, about the sensibleness of these ideas and the sort of logical progressions that might take you there. So you're dealing with what seemed to me at times to be completely insane notions, but dealing with really, really sane people. So there's an interesting kind of cognitive dissonance there for me, and that sort of is one of the major themes of the book, I think.
What conclusion have you personally reached about transhumanism? Do you think it's inevitable?
No, I don't think anything is inevitable. What I do think is bound to happen is that some of these things, whether through direct pursuit of these technologies and transformations, are going to come about, or through kind of just general medical science. And I think what may happen is that, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, 150 years from now, we'll probably look back on transhumanism as this quite strange, eccentric movement that nonetheless predicted certain things that did come to pass. But I have no crystal ball.
You seem unnerved many times in the book. What is your attitude now? Neutral, disapproving, approving? How would you characterize your attitude towards the idea of transhumanism now?
I would say it's become more complicated, if anything. I went in kind of looking for answers and found only questions, and anything that I did hold quite certainly going in became muddied and sort of more ambivalent. So one of the things that struck me when I was writing the book is that I went in looking to find out what it meant to be a machine, which is of course the title of the book, and I just wound up more confused about what it meant to be a person. And so that's part of what was so interesting about writing the book, and hopefully what's interesting for people reading it. One of the things that kept coming up again and again when I was meeting with these people and discussing their attitudes towards death and my own was I would inevitably be accused of what they call deathism, which is a kind of a Stockholm syndrome attitude towards death, where you try and justify the fact that we die and make it seem almost like a good thing. And I did sort of see where they were coming from, because my attitude towards death is it's terrible. It's completely unacceptable that this has to happen to us, and that we spend half of our lives in decline towards this inevitable cessation of consciousness. It doesn't bear thinking about. But at the same time, I feel like if there is a sort of a source of meaning in life, it is this finitude. It's the fact that we're, that we're going to die, that we're finite creatures, and that we only have a small amount of time. And so I sort of did work myself into a position of thinking, okay, maybe death is okay. And then at a certain point when I was writing the book, towards the end of writing the book, I had a bit of a health scare where, I thought I might have had cancer. Thankfully, I didn't. And that sort of, I don't know that it changed my position towards transhumanism, but it definitely changed my attitude towards death. It became much less abstract all of a sudden. And yeah, much more kind of viscerally real. So I sort of lost my cool, ironic abstraction about the topic that I'd been sort of maintaining all the way through.
Do you feel now that time is a precious, finite resource in you? For
sure, yeah, definitely. Although I hold that in my mind, it doesn't necessarily change how you live your life. I still waste a lot of time. Certainly spend time doing things that I probably shouldn't do or don't want to do. I realize that every moment is precious, but I guess you can't really live like that, or certainly I can't. But I'm definitely driven by a sense of confusion, of not understanding things and of trying to get to a point of understanding through writing. So I can't write from a starting point of having something to say, of knowing what I want to say and saying it in a piece or in a book or whatever. I always start from a point of view of like, what do I know about this? What can be said about this? What do I think about this? And try and figure out what I think about something through writing about it. I'm sort of an inherently ambivalent person. And I think that's a good position to take as as a writer of nonfiction, certainly. I don't respond well to people who know what they think about something and have a really strong opinion to put over. I kind of find that somewhat alienating as a reader, and I don't work that way as a writer. And if you write sort of with a sense of attention to how the world is and how complicated it is, you're going to be funny, I think, as a kind of a byproduct of that. Because, I mean, the world is an absurd place. The things people do are completely absurd. And to overlook comedy in any of that is to completely reduce or oversimplify the world. So yeah, no, I hope it is funny. And I think there are moments where the only reaction is a kind of absurd laughter.
The funniest scene in my mind is being on the RV made like a coffin and blah. Could you just briefly tell us about that experience, just in the simplest way you can?
Yeah, well, that's the sort of climax of the book, and in a certain way, that, I don't want to say it wrote itself, but the structure was already there and the comedy was already present. So I had to do very little with it. Essentially, I spent a few days with a man called Zoltan Istvan, who was running for president on an independent transhumanist platform, kind of on the idea that he wanted to raise awareness about the problem of human mortality and the need to invest government funds in research to solve the problem of human aging. So what Zoltan did was he converted a giant recreational vehicle, like a 1977 Bluebird Wanderlodge, an old school bus essentially, into a giant coffin. So he drove this giant coffin across the continental United States. And I was in touch with him for quite a while. I met him very early on when I was writing the book. And it was only quite a bit later that he decided he was going to run for president. But I spent a few days with him in the coffin, driving across Texas. And that was, it was a pretty absurd and memorable experience.
What's your next book about?
My next book is about the apocalypse.
You're a barrel of laughs, aren't you?
Yeah, that's all I know. It's about the world ending, and hopefully the world will not have ended by the time I get to finish the book.
So you've written a book about your own death in a weird sort of a way, and now you're writing a book about everybody's death. Yeah,
in a way, it's like, I think I'm fascinated by just extreme reactions to reality, to human sort of the human situation, and in a way, like transhumanism is quite an apocalyptic set of ideas. It's predicated on the notion that things are going to change very soon. We're going to reach this sort of eschatological moment where our experience is transformed into something completely different, and the world as we know it is going to end. And so, there's a lot of apocalypticism to that whole set of ideas. So, in a way, this next book is sort of a continuation of that investigation. But where the first book is looking at sort of radical optimism, this one is obviously much more pessimistic. It should be funny too, I don't know how, but hopefully it will be.
So what books have you almost written?
I almost wrote a book about self-help. In fact, this book, To Be a Machine, started out its sort of weird trajectory as a book where I was going to sort of investigate various self-help movements and consume as much self-help literature as I could and try to apply some of those ideas to my own life in a quite earnest effort to change myself, to change the way I lived and to change certain aspects of my own personality that I was very unsatisfied with. And that, through sort of various grapplings with the topic, became an obsession with like a species level self-transformation movement, which was transhumanism. So I almost wrote that book, but didn't. I don't know if I ever will. I might go back to it. I don't know. I've also almost written a book about the books I've almost written. I was quite preoccupied with my own kind of creative inefficiency, my own sort of pattern of starting and abandoning projects. And for a while, I was quite taken with the notion that there might be an idea in that there might be a project in the idea of abandoning projects. But I abandoned that project, inevitably.
What aspects of your personality were you dissatisfied with?
My inefficiency, my inability to get things done, my distractibility, my kind of my own sense of my intellectual shallowness, which is sort of manifested in an inability to focus on one particular task. Just sit down and read a book and read it until it's done, rather than getting distracted by another book. Then you kind of go, oh, I want to read that one instead. So there was a lot of that, and it lent itself to a sort of a comic writing about the self, but it was also motivated by real anxiety about, like, what am I doing? Why am I living like this? So it was a kind of a crisis that I was in, a sort of crisis of my own kind of, if nothing else, just inability to be productive. And so I wanted to turn that into a form of productivity, which is a nice idea, but it just never happened. But it became this book.